August 31st, 1943, 0730 hours, 120 miles northeast of Marcus Island, Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer squinted against the morning sun as he scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat. The aircraft carrier USS Essex rolled gently on the swells below, surrounded by the rest of Task Force 15. His squadron, VF-9, had been tasked with the first combat deployment of the Navy's newest fighter. 6 weeks of training exercises, endless briefings, and now they would face the real test. Combat against the vaunted Japanese Zero. The Essex's deck crew had worked through the night, preparing the first wave of Hellcats. 24 aircraft stood in precise formation, their blue-grey paint schemes catching the early light. Brewer ran his hand along the control panel, feeling the solidity of American engineering beneath his fingertips. The F-6F represented over a year of intensive development, a direct response to the Zero's dominance in the early Pacific War. Bat-1, this is Essex Control. You are cleared for launch. Wind is 15 knots from the northeast. Good hunting. Brewer acknowledged the transmission and signaled to his wingman. The deck officer raised his flag, then dropped it with practiced precision. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared to life as Brewer pushed the throttle forward. 18 cylinders generating 2,000 horsepower propelled him down the deck. The aircraft lifted smoothly, climbing into the Pacific sky with a responsiveness that still surprised him after months of flying the older Wildcats. 23 more Hellcats followed in quick succession, forming up in combat spread as they gained altitude. Their mission: neutralize Japanese air defenses over Marcus Island ahead of the bombing run. Intelligence reported approximately 30 Zeros stationed at the island's airfield, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific who had never encountered this new American fighter. Bat Squadron, this is Bat-1. Brewer's voice crackled over the radio. Maintain Angels 15. Keep your intervals tight. Remember your training. Don't get drawn into a turning fight. Energy is our advantage. At 15,000 feet, the formation leveled off, engines throttled back to conserve fuel for the coming engagement. Brewer checked his instruments, then gazed toward the horizon where Marcus Island would soon appear. The mission plan gave them a 20-minute window to clear the airspace before the SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived. 7 minutes into the flight, Ensign Thomas Parker's voice broke the radio silence. Bat-1, this is Bat-17. I have multiple contacts, bearing 045, slightly below our altitude. Estimate 20+ bandits. Brewer strained his eyes against the glare. There, small dark shapes rising to meet them, the morning sun glinting off their canopies. The Japanese had been alerted to their approach. Instead of catching them on the ground, VF-9 would meet them in the air. The first combat test of the Hellcat would not be a strafing run, but a dogfight against the most experienced fighter pilots in the Pacific. All aircraft, this is Bat-1. Tally-ho on bandits at 2 o'clock. Drop tanks now. Bat sections 1 through 4. Maintain course and altitude. 5 and 6. Climb to Angels 18 and provide top cover. 24 drop tanks fell away, tumbling toward the ocean below. The Hellcats, now unencumbered, surged forward as pilots advanced their throttles. 3 miles separated the opposing forces, closing at over 500 miles per hour. 90 seconds to engagement. Brewer tightened his straps and adjusted his goggles. The Zero had ruled Pacific skies for 2 years. Its pilots believed themselves invincible, but everything about to change. The development of the F-6F Hellcat had begun in 1941, long before Pearl Harbor thrust America fully into the war. Early encounters with the Japanese A-6M Zero in China had provided warning signals about its capabilities, but these reports were largely dismissed. It wasn't until the aftermath of Pearl Harbor that the true measure of the Zero became apparent to American planners. Throughout 1942, The obsolescent F-4F Wildcat had struggled against the Zero's superior maneuverability. With a climbing rate nearly twice that of the American fighter and the ability to outmaneuver anything in the Allied arsenal, Japanese pilots established a fearsome reputation. Nicknamed Zeke by Allied intelligence, the Zero's dominance was built on a fatal trade-off: exceptional agility at the cost of pilot protection and structural integrity. The Zero will turn inside you, climb above you, and run circles around you, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had told Brewer during training at North Island. Thatch, who had developed the Thatch Weave defensive tactic as a desperate countermeasure for Wildcats, pointed to the new Hellcat on the tarmac. But this machine changes the equation. Grumman's engineers had studied recovered Zero wreckage from the Aleutian Islands, identifying crucial weaknesses. The Japanese fighter lacked armor protection for its pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement. These omissions made it lightweight and agile, but vulnerable. The Hellcat was designed specifically to exploit these vulnerabilities. Now, as the opposing formations closed to engagement range, Lieutenant Gregory Davis in Bat 11 watched the Zeros splitting into pairs. He had spent 8 months in the Solomon Islands flying Wildcats, developing a healthy respect for Japanese aviators. Those pilots had refined their tactics through actual combat, while most Americans were still in training. Many of VF-9's pilots had never fired their guns in anger. The Zero pilots approaching them represented the Yokosuka Air Group, veterans transferred from Rabaul to strengthen Marcus Island's defenses. Their commander, Lieutenant Aoki Tomatsu, had 17 confirmed kills against American aircraft. His wingmen included 5 other aces, each with multiple victories. They approached with supreme confidence, unaware they faced an entirely new opponent. As the distance closed to 1 mile, Brewer could make out the distinctive silhouettes of the Zeros, their elliptical wings and clean lines unmistakable against the blue sky. The Japanese pilots would be seeing the Hellcat's profile for the first time, perhaps momentarily confused by its resemblance to the Wildcat they had fought before, yet noticeably larger. "Remember your briefing," Brewer called over the radio. "They'll try to draw you into a turning contest. Don't take the bait. Maintain energy. Make 1 pass, then climb and reset." The fatal flaw in Japanese aerial doctrine was becoming apparent. They had perfected a style of combat that maximized the Zero's strengths, but had no contingency for facing an aircraft that refused to fight on their terms. The Hellcat, with its powerful engine, could sustain high-speed attacks and escape vertically, a strategy the Zero could not counter. 30 seconds to engagement. The opposing formations were clearly visible to each other now. Brewer watched as the Japanese pilots tightened their formation, preparing for their standard opening move, a head-on pass followed by a split into turning combat. It had worked countless times against Wildcats, P-39s, and even Spitfires in the South Pacific. But VF-9 was not flying those aircraft. They were at the controls of a machine designed with one purpose: to defeat the Zero. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns against the Zero's 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. It could absorb punishment that would shatter a Zero. Most importantly, it could sustain high-speed combat where the Japanese fighters' controls became dangerously stiff. As the range closed to half a mile, Lieutenant Davis watched the lead Zeros begin their approach. Something about their confidence bothered him. They still didn't know. They had no idea what they were facing. The first shots were seconds away, 6 months earlier, February 1943. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, New York. Test pilot Robert Hall walked through the cavernous assembly building where the first production models of the F-6F Hellcat were taking shape. Behind him, Commander Alfred Pride from the Bureau of Aeronautics consulted a clipboard filled with performance data. "The climb rate is impressive, Bob. "But I'm concerned about the roll rate at high speeds," Pride said, tapping the performance chart. "Pilots report the Zero can change direction almost instantly at speeds below 300 knots. Hall nodded, running his hand along the wing of the nearest Hellcat. "That's why we're not trying to match them turn for turn. The entire philosophy behind this aircraft is different." The Hellcat represented a fundamental shift in American fighter design philosophy. Rather than attempting to create an American Zero, sacrificing protection for maneuverability, Grumman's engineers had embraced a different approach. They built on the rugged dependability of the Wildcat but increased power, improved visibility, and refined handling characteristics. "We're giving our pilots a survivability advantage," Hall explained, pointing to the armored cockpit and the self-sealing fuel tanks. "A Zero pilot gets one mistake. Ours gets several." The most critical innovation, however, was the power-to-weight ratio. The R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, a 60% increase over the Wildcat's engine. This power allowed the Hellcat to accelerate and climb almost vertically, breaking contact when disadvantaged and re-engaging from a position of strength. "But the pilots need to understand," Hall said, lowering his voice as they passed a group of engineers. "This isn't about winning a dance contest. It's about hitting hard, breaking contact, and coming back again. We're building a boxer, not a ballet dancer." This approach represented a considerable risk. American pilots had spent months trying to outmaneuver Zeros, developing complex defensive tactics like the Thatch Weave. Now they were being asked to unlearn those habits and embrace a completely different fighting style, one untested in actual combat. Pride stopped at the end of the assembly line, where a completed Hellcat sat ready for inspection. "And you're confident this approach will work? The Navy is committing everything to this aircraft." Hall climbed onto the wing and opened the cockpit. "The Zero has a critical weakness that few have exploited. Above 275 knots, its controls stiffen dramatically. A Hellcat at full throttle can maintain control at speeds that render a Zero nearly unflyable." The theory was sound, but implementation would require a new generation of pilots trained specifically for this approach. As the first Hellcats rolled off the production line, specialized training programs began at naval air stations across the country. Pilots with Pacific experience shared their knowledge of Japanese tactics, while instructors developed counters that maximized the Hellcat's advantages. Lieutenant Commander Brewer had been among the first selected for the program. A veteran of Coral Sea and Wildcats, he understood intimately the challenges of facing Zeros. During a training exercise off San Diego, he had demonstrated the energy fight concept to a group of skeptical pilots. "Conventional wisdom says never climb against a Zero," he explained after the exercise. "But in a Hellcat, you can sustain a climb they can't match. If you find yourself in trouble, point the nose up and firewall the throttle. They'll stall out before you do." This approach required immense discipline. The temptation in a dogfight was to turn with an opponent, basic fighter-pilot instinct. The Hellcat pilots were being asked to resist that urge, to fight against their training and embrace a style that seemed counterintuitive. By August 1943, the first combat-ready Hellcat squadrons were deployed to the Pacific. VF-9 aboard USS Essex represented the vanguard of this new approach. Their encounter near Marcus Island would provide the first real-world test of the theory. Now, as the two formations closed to combat range, the moment of truth had arrived. Would the Hellcat's design philosophy prove effective against the most feared fighter in the Pacific? Or had American engineers miscalculated, sending young pilots into combat with flawed tactics and unproven aircraft? Brewer tightened his grip on the control stick. The distance between the formations had shrunk to a quarter mile, 15 seconds to engagement. The first shots came at 1,000 yards, earlier than expected. Tracer rounds from the Japanese fighters streaked past Brewer's canopy, indicating their eagerness to engage. He held his fire, maintaining course and speed. The Hellcat's 650 caliber Browning machine guns were most effective inside 600 yards. "Hold formation. Steady," he ordered, voice calm despite the approaching enemy. "Fire at 600 yards, then break high." The opposing formations merged at a combined speed of over 500 mph. For a fraction of a second, Brewer locked eyes with a Japanese pilot, a veteran by the Rising Sun insignia painted beneath his canopy. Then both groups opened fire simultaneously. The Hellcat's 6 machine guns created a devastating cone of fire. Each gun fired over 750 rounds per minute, meaning a 1-second burst sent 75 half-inch projectiles toward the enemy. Across the formation, 24 Hellcats unleashed this firepower in a coordinated volley. The effect was immediate and shocking. 3 Zeros erupted in flames during the initial pass, their unprotected fuel tanks ignited by incendiary rounds. A 4th trailed smoke, its engine damaged. The remaining Japanese fighters executed their planned maneuver, breaking into tight turns to exploit their superior maneuverability. "Bat Squadron, execute thatch climb now," Brewer ordered. Instead of turning to pursue the Zeros, which would have played into Japanese strengths, the Hellcat pilots followed their training. They maintained their speed through the initial pass, then pulled into steep climbing turns, converting their kinetic energy into altitude. The maneuver carried them 1,000 feet above the turning Japanese fighters, who now faced a dilemma: continue their defensive turns or climb to meet the new threat. Lieutenant Aoki, leading the Japanese formation, recognized the unusual tactic immediately. These were not wildcats. The new American fighters had refused the turning fight and were now holding the altitude advantage. He barked orders to his pilots in Japanese, directing them to climb and intercept. This was exactly what Brewer had anticipated. As the Zeros began their climbs, their acceleration gradually diminished. The Hellcats, with their superior power-to-weight ratio, maintained their energy through the climb. When the Japanese fighters were halfway to the Americans' altitude, committed to their ascent with airspeed bleeding off, Brewer gave his next order: echelon attack, sections 1 and 2. 3 and 4 maintain altitude. 12. Hellcats rolled over and dove toward the climbing Zeros, who were now in their most vulnerable state, slow, nose high, and with limited visibility above. The American fighters accelerated rapidly in their dives, quickly exceeding 400 mph, a speed at which the Zero's controls became dangerously stiff. Lieutenant Davis led the second section down, selecting a Zero that had started to roll right as its pilot spotted the diving Americans. Davis pressed his trigger for a 2-second burst. His tracers converged on the Japanese aircraft, striking its wing root and cockpit. The Zero rolled inverted and dove toward the ocean, trailing a thin line of smoke. Across the engagement area, similar scenes played out. The Zeros, caught in vulnerable climbing attitudes, could neither accelerate away nor turn effectively at their current speeds. 7 more Japanese fighters fell to this initial diving attack. The surviving Zeros leveled off and split into pairs, attempting to draw the Americans down into turning fights. 3 inexperienced Hellcat pilots took the bait, breaking formation to pursue individual targets. Immediately, the Japanese pilots executed their signature tight turns, quickly moving behind the Americans. Bat 12, Bat 15, Bat 21, break contact and climb, Brewer ordered, watching the developing trap. 2 of the pilots responded immediately, pushing their throttles forward and pulling into steep climbs. The third, Ensign William Cooper in Bat 15, continued his pursuit, fascinated by his first-ever glimpse of a Zero in combat. Cooper paid for this mistake. The Zero he was chasing suddenly cut power, deployed combat flaps, and executed a flat scissors maneuver that no American aircraft could match. Within seconds, the positions were reversed, with the Zero firing from behind. Cannon shells struck Cooper's right wing, sending the Hellcat into a spin. "I'm hit," Cooper's voice crackled over the radio. Controls sluggish, but responding. The Hellcat's rugged construction saved him. Where a Zero would have disintegrated under similar fire, the American fighter absorbed the damage. Cooper recovered from the spin and dove away, his aircraft damaged but flyable. Meanwhile, Brewer led his section in a second diving attack against the main group of Zeros, which had descended to 12,000 feet. This time, the Japanese pilots were prepared, braking in different directions as the Americans approached. But even this defensive maneuver played into the Hellcat's strengths. The American fighters simply selected individual targets, made firing passes at high speed, then zoomed back up to altitude instead of turning to pursue. Lieutenant Aoki watched with growing concern as his formation disintegrated into individual duels, exactly the scenario their training had taught them to create, but now working against them. The American fighters refused to engage on Japanese terms, maintaining their energy advantage throughout the battle. 20 minutes into the engagement, the outcome was becoming clear. 14 Zeros had been shot down, with 3 more damaged and disengaging. Against this, VF-9 had lost only 1 Hellcat, with 2 others damaged but still flying. The remaining Japanese fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, began retreating toward Marcus Island. Brewer ordered his squadron to regroup at 18,000 feet. Below them, the first wave of SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared, right on schedule. With Japanese air defenses effectively neutralized, they would face minimal opposition over their target. "Bat Squadron, form up for the return leg," Brewer ordered. Mission accomplished. As they turned back toward the Essex, Davis pulled alongside Brewer's wing. Both men exchanged a look of shared understanding. The Hellcat had not just survived its combat debut. It had dominated September 3rd, 1943. Ready Room, USS Essex. The pilots of VF-9 gathered around Lieutenant Commander Brewer as he marked the final tally on the briefing board. 14 confirmed kills, 5 probables, and 3 damaged. Against this, 1 Hellcat lost and 2 damaged. All American pilots had returned safely, including Ensign Cooper, who had ditched his damaged aircraft near a destroyer on the return leg. "Gentlemen, what we witnessed 2 days ago wasn't just a victory," Brewer said, his voice measured. "It was validation of an entirely new approach to aerial combat in the Pacific. In the 48 hours since the battle, intelligence officers had debriefed each pilot extensively. Gun camera footage confirmed the squadron's claims and provided valuable insights into the effectiveness of their tactics. What emerged was not just a successful engagement, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the air war." Lieutenant Davis pointed to the map where their engagement had taken place. "The Japanese pilots kept trying to draw us into turning fights. When we refused, they seemed lost, like they had no backup plan." This observation proved critical. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had relied on the Zero's superior maneuverability to dictate the terms of engagement. The Hellcat's refusal to fight on those terms had completely disrupted their tactical doctrine. More importantly, it had exposed the fundamental weakness in Japanese fighter design philosophy: the sacrifice of pilot protection and structural integrity for maneuverability. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Nimitz's headquarters requested detailed reports, which were subsequently distributed to all fighter squadrons. Within weeks, the energy fight doctrine demonstrated by VF-9 became standard practice across Navy and Marine Corps fighter units. The Japanese response was more complicated. Initial reports dismissed the engagement as an anomaly, perhaps involving inexperienced pilots. But as more encounters with Hellcats produced similar results, reality became impossible to ignore. The Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm faced a new opponent that exploited their weaknesses while negating their strengths. Lieutenant Aoki, one of the few survivors from the Marcus Island engagement, submitted a detailed report to his superiors. "The new American fighter refuses conventional combat," he wrote. "It attacks at high speed, then climbs away before we can respond. We must either develop new tactics or accelerate deployment of our own improved fighters." But Japan's aircraft industry, already strained by material shortages and bombing campaigns, could not rapidly produce a counter to the Hellcat. More critically, the Japanese training program could not replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being lost. Each veteran pilot shot down represented thousands of hours of training and irreplaceable combat experience. By early 1944, the consequences of this shift had become strategically significant. Hellcat squadrons established air superiority over increasingly large areas of the Pacific, protecting American shipping and supporting amphibious operations. The Japanese, forced to commit their dwindling number of experienced pilots to desperate defensive actions, saw their capabilities steadily erode. The statistical record tells the story clearly. Between September 1943 and August 1945, F-6F Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat at a loss of only 270 Hellcats, a kill ratio of 19-1, the highest of any fighter aircraft in the war. 6 months after the Marcus Island engagement, VF-9 was rotated back to the United States. Their combat experience became the foundation for training new Hellcat pilots, who carried forward the lessons learned in that first encounter. Lieutenant Commander Brewer, promoted to commander, personally supervised the development of the advanced training program at NAS Pensacola. "The mistake we made early in the war," he told a class of new pilots, "was trying to fight the Japanese on their terms. The Hellcat gave us the tool to fight on ours." On August 15, 1945, as Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Hellcats flew combat air patrols above the fleet in Tokyo Bay. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Gregory Davis, now a squadron commander with 18 confirmed kills. As he looked down at the defeated Japanese capital, he recalled that first engagement near Marcus Island, the day when everything changed. The official after-action report of the Marcus Island engagement, dated September 5, 1943, concluded with a single sentence that encapsulated the significance of what had occurred. "The introduction of the F-6F Hellcat to combat operations has established a clear technological and tactical advantage that, if properly exploited, will render Japanese air power increasingly ineffective as a strategic factor in the Pacific theater. History would prove this assessment correct. The Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero, had not merely evened the odds, it had fundamentally altered the nature of air combat in the Pacific War.